Yeah, I'm going back, just hanging. So often when we sing these hymns, we get to this part, about third, fourth verse, where we're just in a rut and we don't really listen or pay attention to the words. But this particular verse here is very meaningful and really relates well to the text that we've read this morning. Lord, you show us love's spirits, gifts, empower us for the work of ministry. I said at early service I could probably just say amen and sit down, but you pay me too much money to do that, so I'm going to preach the sermon I've written. Jesus tells us a story this morning. He says there was at a certain city there was a judge who feared neither God nor respected people, a judge who had no righteousness, and the word in Greek is adikos, which means one who is without any sense of righteousness, not a bad man necessarily, more like an amoral man. It's not like immoral, where somebody is choosing to do the wrong thing. They just don't care. In fact, that's what he says. This is an official that didn't care. Didn't care about what people thought. Didn't care about what God thought, I guess. He was one of those small town functionaries that were common in Jesus' day. Every town had one, kind of a combination, city manager / justice of the peace. They were appointed usually by a leading citizen or perhaps the rabbi, depending upon the size of the synagogue. Their job was to make sure that all those small fry matters that were common, at the ground level, never rose up above the surface of the water, so nobody who was of any importance would ever have to deal with them. So he dealt with all the, border disputes and the fence, where the fence was too high or too, those kinds of silly things there. They might have had a passing understanding of the Mosaic law, but they were not Pharisees or scribes. And because they were appointed and not elected, they were beholden to no one and no thing. No association like a bar association or constitution. They didn't give a darn about public opinion because they didn't have to. Now, in the same city, Jesus said, there was this widow who came to the judge and said, grant me justice. And here again, the Greek is very clear. The word using is dikaio, which means grant me what is rightfully mine. This widow was not there complaining, was not there saying, hey, this person is not a libel suit. She was saying, give me what was my right. She was asking for no more than she deserved. But widows back in those days had no legal rights at all, no social status, and so it was easy for the judge to look over the bench and go, nope, that'd be the end of it. Now, since this is a parable and we're supposed to put ourselves into the story and maybe imagine it in our mind's eye, let me tell you how I imagine this parable working out in my mind's eye. The widow hears the judge's no. Everyone expects her to go home and sit down and shut up, come to the conclusion you can't fight City Hall, move on, get over it. But that's not what she does. Instead, she gets up the next day and she sets her face like a flint and she marches right back down to City Hall again. She stands before the same judge, and when he looks over the rim of his half glasses and says to her, didn't I just throw you out of here the day before? She says, look, I want justice, you jerk, and you're going to give it to me. And so he orders the bailiff to throw her out. The next day, she marches down to City Hall or takes a bribe. He administers justice right there for the widow. For the widow. And the judge throws her out again. Next day, she comes and she's wearing one of those T-shirts you get made at the local shop. The T-shirt says, your honor has no honor. And the bailiff throws her out again. The next day, she comes back, and by this time she's there so long that they know each other on a first-name basis. The bailiff says, well, hi, Shirley. You come back again? I'm calling her Shirley because now she reminds me of my mother. She won't shut up. She won't let go. And I suspect that, like my mother, she asked about his family. Hey, Ralph, how's the wife and kids? And she brings him a plate of homemade sugar cookies with caramel icing. My story, remember my details. I can do what I want. This widow is like a tick on a hound dog's butt. She is pushy and persistent and relentless, and she knows that life isn't fair, but she also knows that she doesn't have to lose heart because she's read the Bible. She may not need a good lawyer. She knows that God is the defender of the weak. And even though she keeps getting thrown out by the same bailiff, she just keeps coming back again and again and again and again until this judge, black and blue and bludgeons, decides he's had all he can take. And he says, and I'm reading here the Greek literally, I'm just going to give her what she wants so she'll stop giving me a black eye. Now, I suspect that what that meant is that a black eye to his reputation, because I can't imagine, well, unless it's my mother, she really wouldn't give him a black eye. Now, this, Jesus says, is how we should pray. This is how you should pray, he says. It's a story about your need to pray and not to lose heart. It's not like God is like that unrighteous judge. He doesn't need to be badgered. Quite the opposite, Jesus says. If a powerless widow can get justice from a guy like that, imagine how much more justice will be granted to God's beloved children who cry out to him day and night. The one who is merciful, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. I tell you, Jesus says, that God will grant justice quickly. So the parable is about prayer. Not your serene supplication, soothing sedative for the spirit kind of prayer. Not your accept your situation and anesthetize your anxiety kind of prayer. Not the enlarge your territory or your bank account kind of prayer. Jesus is speaking of that squeaky wheel kind of prayer. That thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven kind of prayer. The kind of prayer that won't accept anything less than what's right. The kind of prayer that gives sin and people like this judge a black eye. Mother Teresa once visited a prominent lawyer in Washington, D.C., whose name was Edward Williams, and she was trying to raise money for her AIDS hospice in New Delhi. Williams was in charge of one of the largest charitable foundations in Washington, D.C., and he tells the story of that visit. It seems that he really didn't want to have her come. He did not want to make a contribution because back in those days, supporting an AIDS hospice was not a politically correct thing to do. It wasn't even considered a polite thing to do. But since she was, by then, a Catholic saint, you don't say no to them, and so he decided he would politely listen to her and then politely tell her no. And so Mother Teresa arrived wearing her traditional sari and her nun's wimple, and she sat across this big mahogany desk, and she looked into the eyes of this man who was wearing a $1,000 silk suit, and she talked about the work of her AIDS hospice. And she made her pitch, and Williams listened politely, and then he politely said, "Mother, I'm so touched by your appeal, and I admire your work, but unfortunately, it does not fit our ministry profile, so I'll have to tell you no." And she reached across the desk and she grabbed his hand and she said, "Let us pray." And they bowed their heads and they prayed. And when she was done, she made exactly the same pitch, using exactly the same words. And once again, Williams, exactly with his words, politely refused. And once again, she grabbed his hand and she said, "Let us pray." And they did. And for the third time, she made exactly the same pitch. And that's when Williams said, "Let me get you my checkbook." Now, you may have heard a definition of prayer that goes something like this. Prayer is conversation with God. And that's a good definition. The problem with conversation is that we get the idea that it's a two-way street. We talk to God and God talks back. I don't know about you. Maybe some of you live better lives than me, but that's not the way it works in my life. Not exactly like that, at least. Another scholar describes prayer like this. He says, imagine it's late at night and you come to a room and all these people are already engaged in a heated conversation. They're sitting around a table. And you know when you get there, the discussion has been going on a long time before you arrived, and no one there is going to stop and retrace the trajectory of the conversation for you. And so you listen for a while, and eventually you drop an oar in the water, and then you begin to say things after you've listened. You speak. Someone answers. Someone attacks you, and then somebody else comes to your defense, and that goes on for a while. The discussion continues. The hour grows late, and you look, and it's time for you to go, and you do. But the conversation, the discussion, that keeps on going, and you know that when you leave. We call that discussion, this man said, prayer. The gathering of the faithful who have been in conversation with God and his world since the beginning of time. The church's prayer, along with its worship and its witness, are the public ways in which we participate in the ongoing discussion between God and his creation. And this parable, the story that Jesus tells, gives us some insight on how to enter into that discussion. The important thing, Jesus says, just drop yourselves into it. Just keep at it. Just be persistent. Don't give up. Strain to hear what God is trying to say, because God is never done talking. The discussion is never over. Not until the end of time, because we serve a living Lord and the Word of God is not chained down to events or times or places. The life of faith goes on as we go on in this unending prayer conversation with the Creator. We may have started as just creatures, but at some point, God granted us the time and the grace to be a part of the conversation, to have a say in how the world is crafted. Wrongs are still committed. Injustices are still done. Unjust people still exist every time and every place. But we are part of the conversation. That explains why Jesus did not end the stories we call parables with, and they lived happily ever after. We were made to be in discussion with God. And my job as a preacher, by the way, is not to tie up every loose end you hear in church. Not to wrap it up with a ribbon and say, see, that's how it works. Go and do that likewise. My job is to open the door and invite you to the table, literally and figuratively, to find a place in the conversation, to join into the discussion, become part of God's people. Karl Barth once said that prayer, when we clasp our hands in prayer, we're participating in an uprising against all the injustice, all the chaos, all the disorder in this world. And given that he said that during the midst of the Second World War, during the midst of the Nazi takeover of Europe, he knew something of what he was talking about. For this is a world that's going to be made right not by a picket line or a protest march or a policy decision or an election. Sorry, Americans. We're not going to make it right with a vote. Keep on praying, Jesus said. Do not lose heart, Jesus said, because your prayers are heard. And justice is coming as swift and as certain as the dawn. And whenever you are tempted to think your prayers have been put on hold, or that you've been left standing in some heavenly Bureau of Motor Vehicles line with the wrong documentation in your hands, remember this. Your heartfelt prayers have been heard. They've been heard like a mother hears a crying baby, like a father hears the cries of a child in the middle of the night. That's how God hears prayer, every day, every night. Lutheran pastor Walt Wangerin was diagnosed about 5-6 years back with stage 4 lung cancer. Now, if you don't know Walt Wangerin, he's a wonderful preacher, a tremendous author, beautiful storyteller. He wrote letters to those whom he loved in a book titled Letters from the Land of Cancer. I want to read you one that he wrote to his wife. He calls her Than, short for Ruth Ann. Wangerin writes, "She prays to God for my healing. She does not mince words, my brave paraclete. She does not approach the Almighty slantwise, but head-on, fearlessly, fully aware of the elemental difference between her and her Creator. Please, Jesus, heal Wally. Not so much as an, if it be your will, O Lord. She wants this healing to be his will, and that's why she prays for it. But her manner is not fierce. It's not demanding or angry or desperate or wheedling. It has all the shining trust of a child speaking to a beloved parent. And when we sit together at communion while others file forward to the altar and sunlight floods the sacred nave, I know what you are doing, Than. I know the meaning of your bowed head and your closed eyes and the straight line your mouth makes in concentration. There's a hymn I've come to associate with my death. It moves me when we sing it as a congregation, as you sit beside me in prayer. When the evening gently closes in and you shut your weary eyes, I'll be there as I have always been, with just one more surprise." I always choke up at those words and can only listen while others sing. You scoot close to me so our bodies touch. I see the tears trembling on your eyelashes, and I think, we should sing this hymn at my funeral. And that's the closest I come to a prayer for my own healing. This declaration that in the end, healing will surely come to me. And until that day, I am comforted, my dear wife, by your persistent prayers. God knows we live in a broken world, a god-awful world, a world that is full of people who fear neither God nor respect other people. All you have to do is watch the news for 5 minutes to see this. A world where there is a delay between prayers heard and prayers answered, and for many, this delay makes them lose their heart, perhaps even stop praying altogether. That's why Jesus asked today, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? That's the end of his story. That's the question that hangs over us all. Will there be anyone audacious enough left to pray for a better world in a world like the one where we live? Is there anyone who still believes that prayer can make a difference? Is there anyone still faithful enough to enter into conversation with God? Will God's people cry out day and night for justice, or are we just too worn down, too discouraged? When the Son of Man comes, will there be a people in this place who have refused to hear the world's no and have strained to hear God's yes? When he comes, will the Son of Man find anyone as indomitable as a 4-foot, 9-inch, 80-year-old nun, or the wife of a dying pastor, still praying, "Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven"? During apartheid, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and a small band of pastors would gather every day to pray. And then every day they'd march down to the towering government building, and every day they would demand justice. Every day they would be confronted by a phalanx of police officers, men who feared neither God nor respected other men. And Archbishop Tutu would go up to them and say, "We have come for justice because we believe someday God will grant it. And we've come today to invite you to join the winning side because we've read the book and we know how things end and we know who wins." When the Son of Man comes, will he find his children praying? Keep on praying. Give the unjust judges of this world a black eye. Do not lose heart seeking what is rightfully ours. And then invite others to join the conversation with you, to join the winning side. Because, friends, we've read the book. We know how it ends. We know that God wins. To God be the glory. Amen.